here. I work for Converged Security Solutions. One quick note on that. Many of you know me from Evolver. We got acquired. I can go somewhere else. But I'm in the DC area, so you have to be acquired every 2 years. And so I want to thank our presenters. I've got some questions, but we really want to make this interactive. We want you to be able to get questions from them. But I've got a first question for you, because Lisa, you brought up, where in your organization do you sit? Because we've seen FAIR run from everything, risk organizations, to CISO organizations. Where in your organization do you fit?
We're in the CISO organization, report to the CIO.
Okay.
We're in enterprise security, specifically on the governance, and I report to the deputy CISO.
We're in the CISO organization, cyber intelligence.
Okay. So, first of all, I'll start real quick. Any direct questions now? Do we have any questions for them? Go right here.
Oh, okay. How, I work with Lisa, so I know the answer for us, but how big is your team who actually does the work for FAIR analyses? I know when we said 57 analyses, how big is your team? And how, also segregation, sorry, 2 words. How quickly do you guys, is your turnaround time for assessments? I didn't hear the question.
Yeah, so for those in the back room, the real question is, how big is your team and how is it structured?
Yeah, I'll understand. It's not a very straightforward answer. Right? We don't have a dedicated group of people that just do FAIR. So everybody in my group does a little bit of FAIR. And so in my team, I have 21 people, and we have a team of 4 that's sort of dedicated to risk assessments. And then we have another group that does what we call remediation governance, which is just, there's an issue, we need to fix it, or somebody's self-reporting an issue. They use a sort of, I call it a quick and dirty FAIR, to get a quick answer on what we think the risk is of that. So I guess to answer the question of how long, it's sort of all over the place. Sometimes it can take us a month if it's a really complicated issue that we're trying to get an answer to. Sometimes it takes us 20 minutes because we're using a sort of shorthand version of it, because I find that there's really no need to do a full-blown assessment on everything. Like sometimes you can get good enough in about 15, 20 minutes to just give an answer. And what I've found recently that I'm talking more about is, how do I do it in 30 seconds? Like, how do I have a conversation with an executive who says, off the cuff, like, how bad is this? That I can really quickly give them an answer, like immediately, that's going to be 80-20 rule directionally accurate. So yeah, I guess the answer shorthand is somewhere between 30 minutes and a month.
That's a fair answer. I'm in a unique situation. When I was brought into KeyBank, it was my task to onboard the program. So for the most part, it's me. I do have a colleague that I work with, but she has other responsibilities. My main task is to not only perform analyses, but to onboard the program, develop the back end so that we can make it scalable. And that's one of my challenges right now, to turn around analyses quicker, to gather information and try to make connections with other databases, other information that we have already, so we're not reinventing the wheel. So it's kind of just me, but I do also work with operational risk. And I have colleagues that they know, like I said, other people that were in the training, they know what I'm working on. I do reach out to them. We do have conversations where they know not only what I'm working on, but they can give me feedback. And, like you said, there are other people in the mix. So it's not, it has to be a team effort. It can't just be me. I mean, that's good initially, but it's not going to last. So it's got to grow and hopefully have somebody else join the team and that kind of thing, or bring other people in who have other responsibilities.
You're not going to answer because she already is. So.
Yeah, but the rest of us, that's true. So for your benefit, definitely. We are a team of 2.5, and we have a technical SME who has a very strong senior cyber intelligence role, and then Samantha is new to FAIR, and I bring that organizational expertise. So kind of similar, I was brought in, hey, I really want to establish FAIR, and how do we go about doing that? So in terms of turnaround time, It does vary. We are not as quick as 30 seconds or even 20 minutes, but we're averaging an assessment per quarter, and that is a full-blown assessment.
Any other questions?
Did FAIR help you determine the level of things that should go to your risk register? Let me explain why I'm asking that. So the time that we tried to do this before and really use the risk register, I think we started too granular, then we were back, and I think our level was too high. And so really struggling with hitting the right level of granularity in the risk register, and did FAIR help you do that? Or was that a separate exercise for you?
I can jump in. What we found was that our risk register was a little bit useless, unfortunately. The data they had, again, when I came on board, it really wasn't helpful. So what we had to do is have a little workshop, got the right people in the room to say, what are let's talk about our top 10 or top 15 risks. Just start spitball and get the right people together and start brainstorming. Once we did that, then we started to just put very high level estimates of what they thought the annualized loss exposure could be. Very, very high level, no analysis. That had us circumvent our current risk register. So it's not answering your question specifically.
No, it makes me feel better, actually.
But, and there's nothing wrong with that. What I'm finding is that I don't know if you guys have the same experience, when we dig deeper, we find that some of the information is not there. It's not, there's a risk register that's prioritized, but it wasn't prioritized well. Or it's just kind of an afterthought, that kind of thing, so.
We had a similar experience where the workshop was very much qualitative, and we did look at, the lens that we looked at it from was FAIR terminology, the threat, the effect, the asset of concern. And what we found was the existing risk registers did not even have that type of defense in their, however they put it together, their methodology. So we've tried to actually broadcast that as, even if you don't go through FAIR, other functions, that quick triage, and it really is like a workshop of just making sure you have the right representation in that meeting. So that worked for us to get that initial list.
Then once you go to FAIR, you go back and fix your risk register, or you're just not using it?
Yeah, we went back and fixed that. So I echo what you guys were saying about it. The terminology was a big problem, didn't connect. What we found is we were able to take risks out when we started doing that real risk analysis. Hey, this really isn't that big of a risk, right? We have controls in place. And what we did just 6 months ago is we took literally every risk that's in there and put them through an analysis to try to get rid of some. It was probably about 15% of them we got rid of, just because they're really not as risky as we thought they were.
So I'd like to add on to that.
Just as a note, I'm going to try to repeat the questions so the people in the back are
All loud. So
Okay, she's loud. Okay.
I'm pretty sure everyone can hear me, right? So when you said that you removed things from your risk register because you determined that they weren't risky, I think my question would be, a lower or not as risky today can change tomorrow depending on, so you might lose visibility to things that you've taken out. My question is, what was going in the risk register to begin with, and were they tied to direct controls, weaknesses, or inability to meet what you'll define as compliance type things against security expectations, policy standards, controls? And did you take stuff out that wasn't aligning to that, and then you know what I'm trying to get to?
Ours was very driven by compliance. It was
okay.
a lot of compliance
So
stuff.
the thumb in the air.
Yeah, and lots of that, and so we just got rid of it. And part of that, part of what we tried to do, and this is getting into a whole different conversation, we went and redid our risk taxonomy at the same time, and so we're getting to a much more risk event-based conversation, and by doing that, we're able to still measure, and we can talk more about it sort of separately, because I'm sure everybody here doesn't want to go into a risk taxonomy conversation.
No, I'm sure everybody does.
I don't know, it gets pretty boring pretty quick, but so we took that and built some metrics around it and made sure we could tie in our controls and tie in our issues that we know about. And so all of our efforts are around those risk events. And so that way, if we take it out of the risk register, we're still showing up in our risk taxonomy. So if we start to see risk come up in one of those events that we're worried about, then we can put something in the risk register. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Okay. Next question.
I've got a two-part question. One is, what was the most powerful thing to getting executive buy-in for each of you? And what is it that keeps them engaged now?
I can go first. So, NYDFS was the biggest driver for us to get sort of full scale adoption. And the reason was because that created such a panic from our executives that are we going to be compliant with this regulation? We were able to use FAIR to justify not having MFA on one of our applications. And that sort of argument was, I don't want to make it sound like that was easy. Like we just showed them the results and they're like, oh, thank God we're done. It was probably a 6-month sort of debate, heavy debate. But being able to show them the data behind it, the methodology we use, they were able to understand it. It was a great sort of two things. Like one, it helps them understand that, hey, we do know what we're talking about. We did the research, we understand this. But also that was a way for us to educate them on FAIR and how it works. And ever since that, they've started picking up some of that terminology and using it, not realizing that it's actually FAIR terminology. You sort of just start hearing it occasionally. Someone will say, well, some risk will pop up, and like, well, what's the most likely scenario here, or something like that, which they would have never said a year ago, right? So for me, that just sort of sticks in my mind as sort of that turning point of them being able to be like, okay, I sort of get it. So I guess in that regard, I'm very thankful for the regulation.
For us, I think where the value is it's said over and over, but prioritizing by dollars. But like you said, you found risks that were low or that were high that could have become low and off your risk register. By addressing the real high priorities, by reanalyzing everything and putting a dollar amount to it and reprioritizing, you start to look at the top priorities. And our deputy CISO was a huge proponent, pusher of FAIR. And they just couldn't get it on board at the time. And then I had a lot of backing. So I also came from a different perspective. I wasn't trying to force it into the business. And so there was some legwork done already.
Yeah, I think I'm in a similar boat to Rob. My CISO is a real supporter of FAIR and tried in other parts of the organization to see it gain momentum. Now that it's been successful out of the cyber intelligence team, it gives him and then me subsequently great access to other executives across the company, and we're to have very engaging dialogue about where our investments are and what we're doing in terms of risk analysis. So it definitely has support to kind of continue the discussion about the items on the risk register. So as we have that initial qualitative list of this is where we see things, and then we did full-blown analyses, some of them we realized, well, there is very minimal risk, but the minimal risk is because our controls are so tight, and we've built this process that is both automated and manual, that there are a number of checks and balances. And it doesn't necessarily then fall off our priority list. It actually gives us some comfort that what we've been doing and the investments that have been made are sound investments. So, but in terms of priority, we then know we won't put more money towards securing that particular project because it seems to be humming along. And, that's kind of worked for our team.
But Matthew, you mentioned DFS. I don't know about I can tell you, Mike, there's several years you probably correct. I'm guessing you will probably get questions on that.
Sure.
As soon as this is over, Steve will probably agree to say it. Because that's interesting you mentioned about regulatory drivers. We have a lot of them now. With everything from the SEC, now California, now New York, we've got a lot of them. So I've got a quick question for you. Data reuse, collection and reuse. How much reuse of scenario data have you been able to do, and how do you manage that data after you've collected it from the different capabilities?
You want it? I'll take it. We're not an immature program, but we're not mature. So we're getting to the point where we're starting to reuse some of that data. So one of the challenges I have now is to try to make this scalable and reuse data. And initially I was just documenting, let's say, control efficacies. Where I'm headed right now is I'm trying to push people to inventory all of our controls, have a control efficacy for every control, and if I can, automate that to align it with assets so that if an asset has 1, 2, 3 controls, we're trying to figure this out, but what's the highest efficacy, and how strong is that resistive strength for that asset? Where we're looking to store this is in GRC, but even if I couldn't do it, I would store it in some kind of database. We're trying to pull that together so that we can make things repeatable. So if we had a centralized store of control information, even if it was a spreadsheet at this point, we'd be able to easily go back to it, even if that was manual. I don't want to do it manual. Again, the whole working smarter, not harder point of view. I want to pull from different areas and get that information so I don't have to go get it every time. And maybe put the onus on the SMEs, put it back on them so that they can update this information. Again, this is more in the future, where I see things going, but I'm hoping that's where we get to. I hope that answered the question.
From a reuse perspective, we just completed, actually at the end of the first quarter, a refresh of what we did in 2018. And that was actually a very easy lift where we went back to those SMEs and we said, hey, did this data change? And in some instances it didn't. So it's great, it's then now good for another year. We're not going to revisit because once we were able to do the compare between year 1 and 2, and our environment isn't so drastic from a change perspective. It's a pretty stable ship. And so having that, I guess, comparison between year 1 and 2, we're able to then reuse that data for this coming year.
Can I add a question to that?
Sure.
Are you depending specifically on inquiry-only type trust of conversations from your SMEs? Or are you also leveraging other technologies to help determine whether or not what they're saying and what's maybe reality in your environment are matching up close enough? Knowing we work in ranges, but we had a scenario recently where from the time we identified the scenario and the time we actually did the quantitative analysis, we did a cleanup in one of our major applications and we reduced the number of records by several million records, which actually creates an overall significant enough change in your primary loss.
Absolutely.
So that's going back to the question, how are you
So we definitely
actually
have
do it?
checks and balances for each SME input and the sources of truth. We're trying to get as much objective information as possible, but in the kind of controls situation, we've got controls teams that aren't necessarily assessing resistance strength of their controls to a numeric value. They're saying pass with recommendations, and I'm like, what do I do with this? So in addition to the controls team, then we look at, are there any self-reported, are there any internal audits? So we are challenging at each point what the SME is giving us to be able to then justify the strength, the range.
Okay, I feel like there's a range.
Yeah, but this is a big topic, maybe because we've had a lot of discussions about that. We were talking about our chapter meeting, what we call the random SME who shows up halfway through the analysis and blows one of your basic assumptions right out of the water, right? You've been working on this thing for 2 months and this guy showed up and says, no, that number's not right. Here's the real number. And then you get back, everybody's shaking their head. We've all been through this, right? Which is, okay. Yes.
So, both your data and your cyber ecosystem are distributed and not really, they're in the cloud, they're with your third parties all over the place. So, how does your model cover all that?
The question is, how does it cover the distributed environments across the world?
For both infrastructure and data.
So we look at it from the perspective of, it really is scenario specific. You try not to boil the ocean. And that would be for your distributed model. You'd have to look at the scenarios specific to that environment. That's our.
I agree. Every time you scope an analysis, you're trying to be as specific as possible. You get better and better at really honing in on what you're trying to analyze. Like Chip said, you have somebody come back and change an assumption later on, or you're talking to SMEs and they start to take you in another direction. You almost have to have this loss event statement in front of you to keep you on course, because if you're talking about an internal asset versus a third party or a cloud asset, you have to know that there's a separation, that you can't have people coming through and say, well, what about this? What about that? And everything possible under the sun. And then before you know it, you're pulling your hair out, losing mine already, and you wind up, it just takes you way off the rails. So you have to be specific and stay on the scope of the analysis.
So I asked the question because there's a scenario. I mean, you guys are all from the financial industry, but you probably know a couple of months back there was a bank in the Midwest that one of their third parties got hacked, and the bank actually had to shut down some of their services. So both their primary services and their DR were actually knocked out by the same hack. So what I'm asking is, how would your model kind of address those types of risks, which in this case, the bank didn't know actually that this one key vendor had both the primary and the DR in the same infrastructure.
I'd like to hope if we did that analysis, we'd find that. Right? It's sort of, to their point, when you look at the scenario, what happens if this vendor gets taken out of business or whatever, right? They get hacked.
AWS disappears.
Right, like,
We got bigger problems.
yeah. AWS is probably a little bigger scale than that, but
This thing you know.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
This is the things you don't know, right? And that's the issue.
Yeah.
yeah, and that's why it's so important, as these guys were saying, is understanding the scenario you're talking about. And in that case, I'm sort of spitballing, but you look at that vendor and say, well, what if we're worried about them going out of business for whatever reason, right? What happens? And it's sort of having that conversation with the SMEs at a basic level of, forget fair, anything else. It's just figuring out what the heck's going on. Like, how do we use them? Like, if this person goes away, who's impacted on our side, and what can or can't they do? And then what's the backup processes for that? And then by doing those sort of interviews, you hopefully find out that they're tied to multiple things, and you start, okay, that's a really critical vendor that we need to make sure that they're not only secure from a security perspective, but also financially secure and viable and all those sorts of things. I hope I'm answering your question, but that's sort of how we go about it, is just trying to understand.
It was sort of a black swan question kind of, right?
Yeah, I think what you find, and maybe I should have mentioned this when we were talking originally, but what I found anyways is as we've started to do this, the interesting sort of byproduct of all of it is that everything you touches matures. Because what you find out is that people don't really know, right? So when you start asking them questions, what happens if this goes away? You see this sort of blank stare of, I'm not sure what happens. And then you start to go through it, and we've seen it in different places where now all of a sudden they have different procedures, and oh crap, we don't have a backup for this going down. Or in other cases, we thought this was really critical, but hey, if it goes down, it actually isn't. We have all these things in place. So let's think about how critical that really is. And so it's been really interesting to see this sort of peripheral maturity that happens just because you're asking those questions and digging deeper that you never would have before.
To add to that, I've had a similar experience where working with, let's say, our cyber defense center, I need stuff from everybody. I need information from them, and I'm always gimme. And then I feel bad, and I'm like, well, how do I reciprocate? How do I not be a pain in their butt? How do I turn it around? That kind of thing happens. I find that they have a little bit of a hole in their knowledge, and I say, well, I'll go ahead and I'll work on this. And incident response, let's say, is something that we started to dig into. And they say, well, we didn't have anything like this. This is great. I say, all right, well, I know I need fair terms, but what are you guys working on? And how can I build this in a way where let's say I throw another field or two or whatever it might be, but that's in your terms, that when you look at it, it's a win-win. There's value on your side, there's value on our side, and then they want to work with me. I'm not just taking from them. So that kind of synergy happens. It's happening more and more. It wasn't happening at first because it just wasn't mature enough. But speaking to them, I find either unknowingly I find a hole in something that they didn't know they had, or I just say, how can I infuse a little bit of what we're doing into what you're working on and vice versa, and it just builds up the overall process.
Sorry, just to build upon the maturity of the other teams, we were able to, I guess, sequencing is a big thing when you're talking about outages, and working with our internal digital workplace, the people that would be responsible for re-imaging machines, going through questions, very granular questions like, well, how much inventory do we have on hand? How long does it take to re-image? Those were questions that prior to our program hadn't actually been methodically answered. And so it seems very granular, some of it, but it definitely helps improve the other programs across the company.
Good time for one quick question.
I don't know if it's gonna be quick. So we're looking at fair-based risk reporting and how we want to do that. What elements of a completed fair analysis do you use to help show, whether through quarterly or yearly reporting, the amount of risk that either a VP is accepting, a department's accepting? How do you do that?
From a risk acceptance perspective, we haven't matured to the level where we've identified that this is the risk tolerance and the appetite. We're hoping that the library of scenarios that we've run so far and some of the improvements that are in play this year will help us have that conversation in 2020. But in terms of risk reporting, what I think has been very beneficial to our team and our program is being able to show the what if. So the loss at 5 million records is this much, the loss at 10 million, the loss at 100 million, and being able to show where the risk reduction, because there are other parts of the equation of the business operations that will be better informed by the what ifs.
I'll give you one quick one as well. If you particularly be using the risk lens tool, the ability, the second level, depending on what questions you would answer, because you would report differently if you're answering a question, how much insurance should I get versus should I buy this product? Now the analysis has all the data, but you would pull out different parts of the analysis to answer a different question. So I want to thank everybody. I want to, first of all, let's give a round of applause for them. I also want to encourage everybody, attend your chapters meetings. They have been fantastic lately. As again, I'm the DC chapter lead. If you're in the area, please come to our meetings, and I will then turn over to Luke to kind of.
Sure. Thank you guys so much for everything. I appreciate it.